In order for a company to properly adjust its books to make sure that all revenues and expenses for a period are recognized within the period that they actually occurred, that company will have to make a series of adjusting entries to bring its books into line. There are a lot of different types of adjustments. Right here we have seven, and the prominent seven. These seven adjustments are pretty much universal amongst all companies. However, they're not the only adjustments that a company could possibly have. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of different adjustments. But to keep things simple, let's just focus on seven main ones that you're going to see a lot. The first is the adjustment for the expiration of prepaid assets. So if your company paid for rent or insurance or advertising in advance, they probably paid for a certain period of time. They said, this we're going to pay right now for 6 months of rent. Well, at the end of each month, some of that rent is no longer an asset because it's been used up. So you need to make an adjustment to recognize the expiration of the portion of that prepayment that has passed with time. The adjustment for supplies used. We buy supplies, we buy markers, printer paper, ink cartridges, etc. And we put them on our books. Well, we're going to use them. So at the end of the period, we're going to have to make an adjustment that accounts for the actual use of those supplies that we no longer have because we used them up. We have the adjustment for what they call asset depreciation. That is the loss of value on an asset over time. Think about a car. It starts losing value as soon as you start driving it. Well, you need to have some way to take the value away from that asset that you have over the life of that asset. Next, you have the adjustment for deferred revenues, and that occurs when there is some kind of contract or job that you are doing where cash changes hands up front, but the performance obligation that you are getting paid for doesn't occur till later. Well, you can't recognize the revenues until you are actually within the period that you are performing the obligation that you have. So you need to adjust your books to account for how much work you have actually done on that particular job at the end of a period. The adjustment for accrued salaries. There's a lot of times where the last day of your month isn't payday. Say you have employees that get paid bi-weekly, and their bi-weekly period is the last week of March and the first week of April. You can't wait until the end of that first week of April, which would be payday, to put it on the books because some of those salary expenses belong in March. That was the first half of the pay period. So you need to make an adjustment at the end of every period to account for how much salary you owe for days that were worked within that actual period. The adjustment for accrued interest. Every credit card, every bank loan is going to charge you interest, and it is constantly accumulating as you have that loan outstanding. So you need to reflect on your books how much interest you owe at the time the period ends. And then lastly, the adjustment for accrued revenues. These are obligations that you're going to do beforehand, where payment for the job comes later. Because again, you have to put revenues on the books in the period that you actually earned them. Well, you're earning them as you're doing the work, even if payment isn't going to occur a couple weeks, couple months down the road. Few terms, and they were on there, that you're definitely going to need to know for adjustments are deferrals and accruals. And the easiest way to differentiate them is when did cash change hands, and when are you going to recognize that revenue or expense. If it is deferral, cash changes hands up front at the beginning of time. However, you won't recognize that revenue or expense until a later period. The loss of value on an asset is a perfect example of this. Say you buy a laptop. Well, cash is going to change hands up front, but the loss of value on that laptop is going to occur over time afterwards. So you're going to exchange cash to acquire the laptop up front, but you're going to recognize the expense periodically as you use that laptop over its life. Same thing is true for the expiration of prepaid assets. Money changes hands up first, you recognize the expense later. And the use of supplies. Again, money changes hands to buy the supplies in the first place, but you don't recognize the expense until later when you actually use them. The opposite of a deferral is an accrual, and that is when you recognize a revenue or expense beforehand, but cash isn't coming till later. And interest on a loan is a great example of this. Your loans are constantly accruing interest, always getting earned, always getting piled onto the loan that you have, but you don't pay daily on a loan. You pay monthly. Some loans are quarterly, some loans are even yearly. which means you're going to have that interest piling up onto your books. And you know you have to pay it at some point, which makes it a liability. You have to put that on the books, but you're not going to actually exchange cash until you make your loan payment at a later date. Same concept applies for the accrual of employee salaries for days that have been worked now, but payday comes later, and for services on a job that you're doing that you won't be paid for until the completion of the job.